We are glad to see you at the open lecture of Professor James K. Гэлбрейт. Professor Гэлбрейт is the professor at the Lindona Johnson School of Public Affairs, University of Texas at Austin. A lecture of Professor Galbraith will be devoted to the intellectual and scientific heritage of his father, prominent economists, not only American economists, but economists of the international scale, John Galbraith. We'll hope that lecture will be interesting and useful for you. But before Professor Galbraith begin to deliver his lecture, I would like to introduce Natalia Narочницкая, famous historian and political scientist, and Professor Narочницкая will say a few words.
Dear friends, dear students, the Moscow University and our Foundation for Historical Outlook are really privileged to receive in Moscow now Professor James Kenneth Galbraith, because at the time of Russian-American relations being so gloomy and at the time where mutual confidence is lost, such a visit of a prominent American expert in international economics and also son of the famous, not only prominent, but famous, internationally renowned economist and political scientist and I would say philosopher, John Kenneth Galbraith, is very extremely and especially precious. Since the lecture is dedicated to the heritage of Professor James Kenneth's father, I would mention that now his heritage is extremely interesting because at the time of the Cold War, at the time of a so-called ideological fight and struggle, which we as students of MGIMO have studied and were supposed to answer correctly, he produced a theory which, if generalized, his ideas, would lead the world to a more harmonious and more tolerant system where every system would give to others such positive things which didn't exist in the other system, etc. So if, for instance, the so-called capitalist, which the world is outdated, of course, because now it's not after the technical and science revolution in the mid of 20th century, the old Marxist theory, well, is not fully applicable to the modern economy. At the time, he was proposing that the Soviet, the communist system and economy would take some instrument and impetus from the so-called capitals and the vice versa, and that would certainly lead also to certain detente in political relations. And now and the world would be more harmonious, accepting, by the way, what is stated and declared in Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. Because Article 1 purposes, goals and purposes, doesn't speak or mention democracy. Please don't think that I'm against democracy at all. But it states the sovereign equality of all systems, of all participants and actors of international life. And that, in today's life, would mean that there shouldn't be rogue states. You have to understand other civilizations, etc. So I'm so happy that such event is now taking place at the Moscow University, the alma mater of thousands of prominent and internationally renowned scientists in all aspects of human knowledge. So we certainly are happy, and we are giving the floor to our precious guest and Professor James Kenneth Galbraith.
Professor Lecture. My friends, it is indeed for me a real privilege and a pleasure to be here in this great university on this glorious day, and to have a chance to speak with you on a subject which is of some professional interest to me, but also, as you may imagine, quite close to my heart. And I do want to underline something that Professor Narshinsky just said, which is that for my father, the project of building a stable and peaceful world was something that was bred in the bone and went back to the very beginning of his life as a farm boy in Canada in the First World War, in a family deeply skeptical of the carnage and horror of that conflict, and all the way through his career in government in the Second World War and in foreign affairs in the 1960s, and his career afterwards as an opponent of the War of Vietnam and as a proponent of a reconciliation between our countries. He was always in that vein, and it was something that was exceedingly important to him. And so I'm quite happy to say that this is a part of the family tradition that I fully intend to uphold. I was asked to come to Moscow to speak on the occasion of my father's, basically very close to his 110th birthday, and to celebrate, among other things, the publication for the first time in Russian of this book, Общество изобилия, the Affluent Society, which was one of the major works of my father that did not appear in Soviet times, but which is now available in Russian for the first time. And I thought I would meet this task, which involved 3 distinct lectures, by developing what was essentially a sequence of talks, and to do it in 3 parts. This is the third of the lectures, but it is the first from a topical point of view. The first part, I plan to deal with the pressures and forces that created the man and the intellect that my father was. In the second part, which I delivered on Monday, if my memory is correct, dealt with the with the core of his literary and economic production, his output, the major books between 1952 and 1967. And the third part, which I gave yesterday, dealt with largely with the aftermath, with what has happened to the world that he described and for which he provided an analytical framework 50 years ago. So today I want to take up the beginning and introduce you, to the extent that I can, going back to a period long before my own life, to the world that created my father and the background from which he came. He, of course, emerged in his time to be, as you've said, a world-famous intellectual, but his background was not especially intellectual, and I would say from the beginning that he was not, in fact, what many cultures, including perhaps this one, would describe as an educated person. He was monolingual, did not speak any language other than English. He did not have any particularly strong mathematical training and did not believe that it was required for economics. His interest and knowledge of music was really very slight. He took a college degree, and he was the first in his family, I believe, to receive one, at the Ontario Agricultural College in southern Ontario. The degree was in animal husbandry. He was a specialist in the raising of cattle. He then went to the University of California at Berkeley and did a thesis in agricultural economics on the expenditure patterns of the governments of the counties, small units of government in the state of California. He told my wife once that he started out in agriculture and found that deplorable, went on to agricultural economics and found that deplorable, so he dropped the agriculture and stayed with the economics. His literary tastes ran to Trollope, Somerset Maugham, Robertson Davies, the bard of the Ontario backcountry. He had a reasonable collection of the classic economic texts of his era, that is to say, from the period from, let's say, the 1890s to the 1930s, Marshall, Taussig, Thorstein Veblen, Joseph Schumpeter, John Maynard Keynes. He read Keynes in 1937 at Cambridge. He knew Marshall well. Veblen, I'm sure he read enthusiastically. But apart from that, how deeply he read even those texts, I have them in my library now, is, let's just say, anyone's guess. He was not a fan of Schumpeter. He remarked to me close to his end of his life that Schumpeter was a fraud, but he didn't explain why he thought so. I think he just thought perhaps that Schumpeter was an insufferable snob. As I said, he grew up on a farm. Horses, cattle, the machinery of the day were second nature. But so was the larger economy in which progressive southern Ontario agriculture was embedded. It was a world of marketing collectives, government extension agents, the government man, promoting agricultural self-improvement on the cusp of the age of the mechanized tractor and the automobile. He did not have a favorable view of horses. His father, my grandfather, doubled as director of an insurance company and as the local leader of the Liberal Party in Canada. He was strongly anti-war in the First World War, as I've said. The art of politics was bred in his bones. They lived in a substantial house, extravagant but not solid. Solid but not extravagant, which is still there. He learned to write first on farm issues for a local paper when he was very young, and then from the English department at the Ontario Agricultural College, then at Berkeley. He published on the economics of beekeeping, a question of externalities and social benefits, but a practical question. But he was lucky, because in the field that he grew up in, the problems, and at the time that he appeared, the problems of agriculture were central to the crisis that hit North America and the world, but especially North America in the early 1930s in the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt, as governor of New York, understood the problems of agriculture very well, and they had the first priority when Roosevelt became president in 1933. And suddenly my father, on a trip back east to take up a position at Harvard in agricultural economics, he was in Washington and signed up to work at the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It was only then, already built in some ways to already embedded in the rising role of the American state in the reconstruction, and for that matter, the construction in the first instance of a unified continental American economy, that his interests broadened and began to take and investigate questions of industrial concentration and mass unemployment. And this led him in 1937 to a year at the University of Cambridge, where he read John Maynard Keynes but did not meet him. Keynes had had a heart attack that year, wasn't in Cambridge. And then made friends with the other disciples of Keynes, Nicholas Caldor, Joan Robinson, although so far as I know did not have much influence on their thought. By this time he had married my mother, an accomplished linguist who had studied in both France and Germany earlier on, and with her they traveled together through much of continental Europe, seeing the rise of fascism at first hand. The rise of fascism, but also the success initially of Hitler's Germany in economic recovery. He returned to Harvard in 1938. He was among the young Turks seeking to bring modern economics of Keynes and related radical ferment to Harvard University, which is first and foremost the guardian of American intellectual respectability. It was not a success. He stood for two young radicals who were purged from the economics department and found himself invited to take a job elsewhere. Went to Princeton, which he did not enjoy, and at the first opportunity as the war loomed, he took the chance to go to Washington, where he became a executive assistant to the chair of the National Defense Advisory Commission, who happened to be the Secretary of Agriculture. So the farming background continued to play a role. One thing that he did there that I learned only more than 3 decades later when I was researching an undergraduate thesis on the war in Vietnam was that he chose the locations, or helped choose the locations, for ammunition factories in the United States, explosives factories. And here the link to agricultural questions was clear. The farming background was relevant because explosives, after all, ammonium nitrates made from fertilizer. And the idea behind those factories was that they would be converted to fertilizer factories after the war. In 1941 came appointment as the deputy director for prices at the Office of Price Administration and Civilian Supply. He was 33 years old, and he had effective control over the entire economy of the United States. He'd been a citizen for 4 years at that point, or 3 years. On the Sunday following the attack at Pearl Harbor, there was a meeting on critical war supplies, and according to family memory, they went through the list in alphabetical order, which was a mistake because it took a long time to get to R for rubber, essential to all machinery, as the farm boy from Ontario knew. The Japanese Navy was at Malaya, and there were no factories for synthetic rubber yet in service. My father and a lawyer, David Ginsburg, left the meeting, and they sat down and drafted an order forbidding the sale of rubber tires in the entire United States. They did not have the authority to issue the order. They walked it around to the commissioners of the agency that did have the authority, said, here's the rubber order. The people signed it without asking who these two men were. They went back to their offices and called the networks, and the next day there were no rubber tires for sale in the United States. Price control in wartime was and is a critical exercise in applied economics. It has both a microeconomic dimension. You have to make sure that goods continue to be produced, but that nobody gets excessive profits from them. And a macro dimension, you have to stabilize the general level of prices so that people are willing to trust the government with their money by buying government bonds. The psychology of stabilization, so that consumers retain confidence in the currency and the public debt, do not flee from money into whatever commodities they can acquire, which then forces the government into either confiscatory taxation or hyperinflation, is what has to be avoided or has to be sustained. For this, it is better that the basics be rationed and that many durables, like new cars, be simply made unavailable than that prices become an object of uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. John Maynard Keynes had imagined in How to Pay for the War, published in 1940, that the matter could be handled almost wholly by macro measures, which he called forced saving. Well, my father had believed at first in selective price controls, just targeting the critical industries. Events quickly disabused him. In May of 1942 came the General Maximum Price Regulation, which imposed comprehensive controls on prices in the American economy, and those with modifications held throughout the war. They had to be enforced. That required a bureaucracy, which grew to number 17,000 civil servants. I asked my father once, where did you find them? And he said, the land grant colleges. I hired the economics departments. All the economics professors out across the country in public institutions were essentially brought in to control prices during the war. There was a visit on one occasion, which is memorialized in this painting by the New Yorker cartoonist Edward Sorel. Oh, it's a little hard for you to see, but you can perhaps make it out, by the greatest economist of the age, John Maynard Keynes. He wanted to see my father, as you can see, the man with the long legs and what he called the ecclesiastical nose. Keynes is there with his mustache. And he wanted to see him not about great questions of economics, but Keynes was raising pigs on his farm in England, and he wanted to talk about the price of corn and hogs, or what he called pigs and maize. And so Sorel memorializes this quite imaginatively with this little photograph of a pig poring over it. I don't think any such photograph actually ever existed. The Office of Price Administration was an institution of great enduring importance, because much of what became the liberal political milieu or movement in the United States passed through the OPA at one time or another. Lawyers, economists, all kinds of statisticians, all kinds of people who continued to have an influence at high levels for much of the rest of their career. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention, at a very low level, the extremely entertaining English communist Jessica Mitford, one of the Mitford sisters who wrote a memoir about her career as an activist in the American Communist Party, called A Fine Old Conflict. She met her husband, a communist lawyer, in the cafeteria of the OPA. It was a dangerous institution from a political ideological standpoint. Post-war conservative economics devoted itself to obliterating the memory of the success that government policy had in controlling prices, controlling inflation, stabilizing the psychology of the country at a time of great economic disruption. The conservative economics held instead that free markets and free prices should be the mechanisms of adjustment, that equilibrium would establish itself, and that indeed these things were synonyms for freedom itself. I think that particular ideology had some echoes in the Russian Federation of the 1990s. The effect of this here was illustrated very vividly. Interestingly enough, in other countries, and notably in China, as a very interesting new dissertation at the University of Cambridge by a young woman named Isabella Weber has demonstrated, reform economists had read my father, had read him in, I suppose, pirated editions published for the use of the nomenclatura, and they followed a traditional price stabilization practice common to China for millennia, but also taking account of the specific mechanisms described in my father's work. The politics of price control were rough even during the war, and by 1943, my father, who was not a shrinking violet, had become a political lightning rod, and he was dismissed, cast back into private life. He attempted to enlist in the army, although it was half-hearted since he knew that at 2 meters he was far too tall. So he went to work as a journalist, as an editor for Fortune magazine in the Time Life Empire. Henry Luce, the chief executive of Time Life, said that he had taught Ken Galbraith how to write and regretted it ever since. But at Fortune in those years, he developed his access to and insight into the American corporate structure, the business classes at the highest level. And from there, he was able to, when he returned to academic life, to speak with authority about the way in which the American economic system actually worked. I want to speak of one other important aspect of his life before he returned to academics, and that was an assignment that took a number of months in the spring, summer, fall of 1945, that was to analyze for the United States government, and particularly for the Army Air Force, the effects of strategic bombing on the German war economy. This was the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. My father was a director of the Strategic Bombing Survey, along with Burton Klein, and he assembled one of the most eclectic and interesting and intellectually independent groups of economists ever brought together as a team. Nicholas Caldor, who incidentally had a research assistant by the name of Carrie Polanyi, daughter of Carl Polanyi. And Carrie is 95 now and still going strong as one of Canada's most distinguished economists. E.F. Schumacher of Small is Beautiful was in that team, I'm told. E.F. Denison, his name I believe is on this list. Paul Baran, later the co-author with Paul Sweezy of major critical and radical book on American capitalism, Monopoly Capital. My father described Baran as the worst soldier in the history of the United States Army. He never tucked in his shirt, never polished his boots, and never saluted an officer unless he was standing next to one at the urinals. According to one family story, Piero Sraffa, later of Cambridge, was also in this group. The survey showed that the bombing had produced reorganization of German industrial production and intensification of its focus on war material, releasing labor from civilian tasks as housing and factories were destroyed. This was a lesson my father never forgot, and he brought it back, for example, in a chapter in The Affluent Society, published 13 years later, describing the ineffectiveness for military purposes of the firebombing of Hamburg. He went, by the way, to Germany immediately as the war ended. He was in Berlin within days of the surrender. He was in Flensburg. He interrogated Albert Speer. He saw Dresden. And the horror and senselessness and military pointlessness of that attack, which cost tens of thousands of lives, continued to haunt him, I think, on and off the rest of his life. It would come up from time to time, and you could see a shadow on his face. From Berlin in 1945, he wrote home that the Soviet soldiers were clean and disciplined, although, this was to my mother, they did appear to have wanted to a man to defecate in Hitler's offices. He said, mission accomplished. And he said that the Soviet soldier who was guarding the entrance to the Führerbunker, which my father and his colleagues wanted to visit, was regrettably incorruptible and would not let them in. He went on to Japan within a few weeks after the surrender there, and the Strategic Bombing Survey produced this report on the effect of the atomic bombs on Japan. It's an exceedingly interesting document. It has a rather graphic account of the consequences. This is a photograph of Nagasaki, and again, you can't see the details, but the caption is rather eloquent, and it's from the Nagasaki Prefecture report of the aftermath of the bombing, like a graveyard with not a tombstone standing. So the power of the weapon and the power of the consequences was not lost on the official reports to the United States government. But there's also something else of historical importance, and this is a section of that report that is noted in my father's hand, which has, I think, considerable importance historically. The conclusion, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to 31 December 1945, and in all probability prior to 1 November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. This caused, among other things related to the survey, caused my father great difficulty when the question of promotion to tenure came up at Harvard. Friends of the Air Force attempted to block it, held it up actually for a year, sympathetic. It took the resignation threat from President Conant of Harvard to get the case through. A sympathetic Air Force colonel said to my father, "The trouble with you, Ken, is that you are too damn honest." And he would continue to show that honesty and a basic clarity of mind through the remainder of his political engagements, and I would argue also in his economic work. Political engagements included drafting what was called the Speech of Hope, given by Secretary of State James Burns in Stuttgart in 1946, setting out the parameters for return to self-government in Western Germany, work on the Marshall Plan. He resisted and survived passing inquiries into his loyalties in the era of Joseph McCarthy, the Red Scare in the early 1950s. And it developed decades later that he had a large file in the hands of Mr. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. He wrote an essay on that for Esquire entitled My 40 Years with the FBI. It's highly entertaining. In the 1960s, his experience with strategic bombing was very much behind his principled and energetic, consuming opposition to the bombing of Vietnam. A couple of other things and his political engagement. He became a leading architect of what became the New Frontier and eventually the Great Society through something called the Democratic Policy Advisory Council. Here he is at 58 or so at a meeting chaired by President Truman. He's right here, Truman is right here. And of course, as I suppose many of you know, President Kennedy sent him to India as ambassador in 1961, 1963, and for that matter sent me, my brother Peter, and our mother along as well. And in this photograph, here we are performing ambassadorial duties, in this case receiving a gift which you will be lucky if you do not get, at any point in your lives a leopard cub as a pet. It was not a success. After about 6 weeks, it had to go back to the zoo. So, as I've presented him, a practical man. His formation in academic economics was eclectic, largely incidental, and I think you could argue insubstantial. But this was a huge advantage. It kept his head clear and open, unfuddled by nonsense, as Keynes had put it in 1929. By the late 1940s and 50s, his reading interests centered on theories of organization and management, on James Burnham, Herbert Simon, Burrell, and Means. He maintained close links to practical economists such as Nicholas Kaldor and Thomas Balog in the UK, Gunnar Myrdal in Sweden, maybe a little bit more distantly, Shigeru Suru in Japan, Stanislav Menshikov in the USSR, with whom he eventually co-authored a book. At Harvard, his closest friend among the economists was an eminently practical figure, and by the way, an exceedingly prominent and important historical economist, a Russian, Vasily Leontiev, but I should also mention Simon Kuznets, who was no mean figure himself. He maintained close political contacts with an undergraduate whom he tutored in the 1930s, who went on to be congressman and senator, John F. Kennedy, who became president in 1961, and with a neighbor from Alexandria, Virginia in the early 1940s, who went on to become Senate Majority Leader, Vice President, and then President Lyndon Johnson. It was an intimate, friendly, fearless relationship, survived many minor debacles, including once in the campaign of 1960, something about agriculture went wrong, and Kennedy said to him, "Ken, I don't want to hear about farm policy from anyone but you, and I don't want to hear about it from you either." In this period, he developed his literary and intellectual position and rose to global fame through 4 books that were published between 1952 and 1967. They were American Capitalism, The Concept of Countervailing Power, published in 1952. The Great Crash, 1929, which was the project of a summer's writing in the Dartmouth Library in 1955, and which was by all odds the biggest seller of my father's works. It has practically never been out of print. And the books that I want to wrap up this lecture by talking about, giving you a feel for: The Affluent Society and the New Industrial State. The Affluent Society appeared in 1958, the New Industrial State in 1967. The Affluent Society, I have to say, one personal word about it is a book of has special meaning to me because it is in part dedicated with my name. I was 6 years old at the time it appeared. It's perhaps the book that most decisively marks his place in the history of economic thought and in the literature of the mid-20th century. It's here that the phrase conventional wisdom first appears, here that the revised sequence by which he meant the importance of the corporation in determining the preferences of the consumer and not the other way around is first elaborated. And here that we have the discussion, which is crucial to his thinking, of the problem of social balance, which is to say of the need to take account of both the public and the private sphere, of the social as well as the personal, the need to deal with the great imbalance of American economic life, which he described in a famous phrase as private opulence and public squalor. These phrases were a matter of art and craft. They reflected in some sense, both an incisive command over the rhythms of the English language, but also a canny sense of what would stick in people's minds. And at his memorial service in 2006, Amartya Sen said, you know, reading him as he had done in the 1950s was like reading Shakespeare and discovering that it was full of quotations. But the book's strength and importance lay in its frontal assault on the core of neoclassical economics and in setting a vast progressive agenda for the 1960s. In some sense, it was the emblematic book of that period. I learned years later, when I gave a memorial lecture for two civil rights lawyers, Clifford and Virginia Durr in Montgomery, Alabama, that the Reverend Martin Luther King had, in addition to the Bible, the Affluent Society with him when he composed the letter from the Birmingham jail. And it's not, I think, by accident that, I think I have this here, yes, that a decade later, in the late 1960s, 3 economics professors from Greece who were imprisoned by the military junta, by the fascist regime, passed some of their time in a prison camp on a Greek island, taking books from the prison library and creating a binding for them out of used matchsticks and shellac. It's a beautiful piece of work, and I have that in my library now. It's a very precious possession. The Affluent Society is, I think, fairly decisively the most accessible and widely read general critique of neoclassical economics, certainly in the United States. It cuts to the core proposition that economics is about scarcity, argues that in the modern world this should not be the case, and therefore to the bedrock assumptions of utility maximization in consumption and profit maximization in the conduct of businesses. It's not merely a departure from this old dichotomy between competition and monopoly. It does not hold that perfect competition, perhaps enforced by antitrust and competition policy, is the way to go, is the ideal to which one should aspire. And therefore, it liberates your thinking from any desire to approximate that supposed ideal. Unlike in Keynes's general theory, there is no special case of full employment in which the competitive market, in which the laissez-faire world comes into its own, even as a special case. There is thus no scope for the so-called neoclassical synthesis, whose practical consequence was to divide economics into macro and micro as distinct and unconnected fields, separated only by Christmas break. The Affluent Society was about defining the problems of the modern economic world, a world in which the problem of production was relatively readily solved. The problem of distribution was not the central one. The central problems were how you came to grips with the need for social balance and with the human and the need to preserve human rights and human freedoms in a world in which corporations play such a predominant role. My father wrote that the Affluent Society was a window, and this book, which appeared in 1967, The New Industrial State, was the house into which that window opened. It was initially drafted in the late 1950s, and rather quaintly, my father stored it in a bank vault during the Kennedy administration while we went to India. Came back, he retrieved it and worked on it for publication in 1967 in the midst of the Great Society, the war on poverty, the war in Vietnam. Perhaps the peak year of American corporate power, of military hubris, post-war prosperity, and also social progress. It was a moment when the American way had its peak reputation in the world, both as a model and as a threat. The Europeans were worried. The Yankees were coming with their big business, and they were going to take everything out, take everything over. For economics, the new industrial state was a major challenge. It expressed the imperative of placing the study of organizations on a plane above that of markets. That the topic, the subject itself should not be about the abstract interaction of independent individuals or business firms, but rather about how economic life is organized in a structured and hierarchical way. Only organization, it argued, permits the division of tasks required for the deep application of technology, the long lead times required to design new products, the management of specific demand to ensure that whatever you're producing, you can sell it, and the management of aggregate demand, the overall movement, the ebb and flow of spending in the economy, so that plans for investment and plans for disinvestment, for scrapping, can be coordinated across the system as a whole. It's organization alone that permits comprehensive control of what my father called a planning system, of the corporate planets around which the rings of small and medium businesses revolve. For those who continued to insist on the latter, on the small and medium as the ideal type, my father said, well, let's have an architectural metaphor. And I look out over this magnificent structure from the 1930s. It's, I think, an appropriate one. He said, the person who sets out to study buildings in Manhattan on the assumption that all are alike will have difficulty passing from the surviving brownstones to the skyscrapers. And he will handicap himself even more if he imagines that all buildings should be like brownstones and have load-bearing walls and that the others are abnormal. You can look out over the magnificent vista here at the new skyscrapers in Moscow and see exactly what he was speaking about. The portrait in the new industrial state is not hostile. It's a description of the American economy along with its power structures, its mitigating and its countervailing forces, its government, its military-industrial complex, as he saw it. To my father, the system had both advantages and disadvantages, flaws and challenges. But the available alternatives did not include utopia, certainly not at a low cost. He was a practical man. To him, realism in analysis presaged realistic problem solving, and he never believed there would come a day when all problems would be solved. It was sufficient to work toward the good, not necessarily even the great society, just to deal with the issues that you face as you face them with the tools that you have available and without rejecting any of them on ideological grounds seems to me and seemed to him to be the essence of a sensible approach to economic questions. At 50 years' time, it's not easy to reconstruct, and for that matter, to overstate the effect that the new industrial state had at the time and its threat to established economics. It was the big book by the most widely read economist since the death of Marx, speaking from a position at the peak of academic prestige, let's say senior professorship at Harvard University, in the most powerful country of the moment, and describing the system that made that country, that had given that country its advantages. You might imagine that the effect of this would be to create an intellectual current that would take up this work and advance it. You might imagine that the obsolete and plainly inadequate doctrines of the classical and neoclassical economics would recede before a realistic account. But this is not what happened. in fact, the economics profession reacted with practically with violence against this book, with a dismissive attitude toward my father's stature and position as an economist, and with an aggressive move into even more abstract and mathematized expressions of economic systems that exist only in the minds of their creators, and that whose reference to which cannot be found in the real world. Academic economics, in short, retreated to a neverland of obscure formal models, dogmatic policy rules, and intellectual incoherence, behind which lurked lobbyists and paymasters, monetarism, supply-side economics, rational expectations, and came and went. Now we have dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium if you really rise high in the field. I won't argue that the new industrial state remained, and it was not intended to remain, as a picture of the world for all time. It was a picture of the world for a particular time, and it provides, as I argue in the foreword to the edition that appeared after my father's passing in 2006 or 7, a way to think about the evolution of economic events over the subsequent 50 years. And I think if you think about it carefully, you'll come to the conclusion that the United States in particular took steps, policy steps at the macro level and at the level of industrial governance and regulation, which undermined the industrial dominance that it had enjoyed for the first 30 years after the Second World War. Steps which broke apart and deindustrialized much of the corporations and deindustrialized much of the American heartland. Steps that restored the preeminence of finance in the American system. Finance had become subordinated to industry. It returned in the late 70s and 80s and 90s into the dominant role and stretched out to become the dominant feature of the American presence in the world economy. And that all of these things have had the effect of creating an American economy with a financial and a technological pole on each coast, a heartland which is substantially disaffected and stagnant, and which has had the political consequence in the long run of delivering us into the hands of Donald Trump, and which has created an extremely, let's say, precarious long-term position for the American economy in the world. It's an economy which retains an enormous amount of short-term power, but where the fragilities are already apparent. And I'll say one more thing before I close, which is that if you look closely at the economies which have come through this period with, let's say, a stronger long-term position, and I would point to Germany first and foremost, but I would also point to these days somewhat underrated but still very powerful economy of the Japan, and also the unquestionably highly successful and rapidly developing economy of the People's Republic of China. That in these three cases, if you scratch the surface of the intellectual traditions that underpin their successful development and of the principles that held together their institutions that had given them a measure of the centrality of industrial organizations, countervailing power, regulatory structures that are efficient, reasonably efficient and effective, that you'll find that not only in practice but also in principle, also in effect, you'll see the influence of my father, John Kenneth Galbraith. And that's, as an American, I can only say more power to them. I wish that my own country had done a better job with the legacy that it had. Thank you very much.
Professor Galbraith, thank you for an interesting lecture. Dear colleagues, thank you for attention and questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to listen to you.
Спасибо большое.
And my question is, what is the economic situation in Russia? And in your opinion, what do we need to improve?
It's a very good question. And you will notice it was not accidental that I did not attempt to answer it in the course of my lecture. Now, why is that? Because it seems to me that American economists, and for better or for worse, that's what I am, have made a very bad reputation for themselves by arriving at other countries and telling people what to do. So give me another week, and then I'll have all the answers for you, I'm sure. But that's only after listening to more people who know much more about it than I do. A couple of things that are, I think, remarkable. One is that compared to the situation that I started coming to Russia for the first time in 1993, I was planning to come in 1970 with my parents, but they had to cancel a visit to the Academy of Sciences because of protests in the U.S. over the Vietnam War, in which my father had to play a role to speak to the protesting rallies. So I only began to come in 1993, and it was a very bleak time. It's very difficult, very grim. And it's remarkable how much this country has been able to recover in, let's say, 15 years since the end of that period. So I cannot say I fully understand yet. I have some ideas about how that has been managed, but I think the lesson that an outsider should take away is that underestimating the resilience and the capacity of the Russian economy is a mistake.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
I can ask them.
Surely there are other questions. There may not be other answers, but you can give me a try.
What are the main problems that economics cannot solve?
That economics can't solve, or that it can solve. Well, that's of course a long list of problems that economics can't solve. The economist has an obligation, in my view, to be useful. I'm absolutely happy to be a member of the Bolnoye Ekonomicheskiye Общества, and I noticed that the symbol of that elegant organization, which was created by Catherine the Great, is a beehive. And as I mentioned earlier, my father launched his career by writing on beehives, and I happen to have a few in my property in Vermont, so I'm conscious of their usefulness. This is what economics should be. It should be a discipline of people who know things about the practical world and who can apply that knowledge in a useful way. It should not be a priesthood catechizing you and making you repeat extremely implausible ideas on the notion that there somehow has been discovered a universal truth. So one has to know the conditions of your own situation, and you have to know what policy levers are available to work on these issues. What are the challenges? Well, of course, we have to talk about climate change. And that if my father were around, I'm sure he would be, this doesn't come up. Pollution and so forth in the 1950s was already an important question, but climate change had not yet surfaced as something that was of the urgency that we understand it to be now. And the second one that we have to talk about, which, as I said, was part of his preoccupation for his entire life, is how to maintain and stabilize the peace. And I have been for 20 years the chair of a organization called Economists for Peace and Security, which has a Russian affiliate, also was called Economists Allied for Arms Reduction at one point. It was founded by very distinguished economists from all over the world. In the US, Lawrence Klein, Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow, James Tobin, my father, Vasily Leontiev. In Russia, Stanislav Menshikov, and quite a number of others. So the objective, economists have a responsibility to keep the pressure on political people to behave responsibly and preserve the conditions under which problems can be solved. And we know that in many cases, people who do not feel that constraint, do not feel that responsibility, tend to take reckless risks. And the history of reckless military risks is replete with disasters. And we can all come up with examples, but of course the invasion of Iraq by the George W. Bush presidency is a very important recent example. And it's our job, in part, to speak for a larger society that says, look, the professional thing to do is to be very cautious. And you mentioned earlier about the role of the United Nations in this respect. The principle of the UN, as you said, was to respect mutual sovereignty and to avoid aggressive war. And avoiding aggressive war is not something simply that's done at the overt level. It has to be something that's avoided at the covert level as well, something that is not launched or threatened or risked by acts of deceit. So all of this is something we each have a responsibility in our own countries. I'm not going to criticize anybody else's country. I'm going to argue that we have it in our own countries to be vigilant about how those people who have responsibility in that area conduct themselves.
Thank you. And one more question.
Go ahead. You're on a roll.
In our English lesson, we watch American news. And
oh, my word. Okay. Better you than me.
And they say that Donald Trump made a huge contribution to America because he managed to decrease the level of unemployment. Is it true, and what do you think about it?
The level of unemployment in the U.S. had fallen already by 2015. So it is substantially due to the process of recovery that occurred under the previous administration. I am not going to get into the game of saying it was this president or that president. The major credit goes to the existence of, first of all, stabilizing institutions, including things like Social Security and Medicare and disability insurance and you name it, unemployment insurance, food stamps, which make it possible for people to survive these terrible economic events and makes it possible for people to leave the labor force, take early retirement. And so the unemployment rate, which is people looking for work, comes down. Doesn't necessarily mean that everybody who might work in a stronger environment has a job, but it does mean that there's a balance between those who are looking for work and those who are receiving it. What's happened since Trump was inaugurated, fundamentally, aside from the continuing inertia of what was going on before, two things. The tax cuts have had a significant effect on business investment. I think that's clear. So that has accelerated growth a little bit. What else? I would argue that the spending of the U.S. government, which has continued on a steady, modestly rising track, has not been cut, in which Democrats and Republicans both got their priorities, got military spending, got domestic spending. So you have, on the one hand, stable government spending and tax reduction. This is definitely going to produce stronger economic growth, and that's what we're seeing. Trump gets, and the administration Yeah, undeniably. I'm not a fan of theirs, but they get some credit for it. But I wouldn't give them, I wouldn't say that the magic man came in and created a miracle out of havoc. That was not the case. There was a substantial recovery before. The recovery, however, is very uneven. Much stronger in the West and on the East coast, and I guess it's okay in Texas, than it is in the upper Midwest. And it was the fact that it was very poor in the old industrial areas that got Trump into the presidency in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Now that gives someone else a chance to think through their question. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite interesting. So I have one question. It may sound a little bit provocative because all the international relations...
Provoke away.
Provocative, maybe.
Yeah, yes.
Of course,
I'm not easily provoked.
Yeah, so international relations is a very difficult thing, but still. Now Russian economy is existing under the pressure of international sanctions.
Yes.
And America is one of such countries who is using sanctions
Mm-hmm.
against Russia. So during my scientific job, I studied the history of sanctions, how they were used, and some other examples. And I found that usually it is a very ineffective mechanism to solve the questions. And I want to ask you, what do you think about the exact example of modern sanctions? Don't you think that such a thing is making more damage to both economies, American economy and Russian economy?
Well, I tend to agree that sanctions impose a cost both on the sanctioner and the sanctionee, on both parties. I think that's entirely right. I agree that sanctions tend to, there are lots of ways to counteract sanctions. So we put sanctions on, embargo on Cuba in 1961, took it off in 2014, and Cuba, the Castro government was in power through that entire period. Right? We have been in a state of hostile relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is still there. So the lesson I would, and you could also look at the South African case, where what drove South Africa to accept an end of apartheid was not sanctions, but rather the Cuban army in Angola and with the Soviet army, with the Soviet advisors as well. But the Cuban army was the decisive factor in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I think that's a pretty good list, which is not to say that you can't have some success with sanctions, and the strategy of targeting individuals, if they happen to be influential, may or may not work in certain cases. But I think in general, you're right, that this is a way of expressing a, let's say, geopolitical hostility, and not, generally speaking, an effective way to bring down a country or a government, or which isn't to say that that doesn't have costs. It has costs for both sides. The other lesson I would draw from all of these experiences is that in the case of the United States, when sanctions get put in place, it's extremely difficult to get rid of them. Even in Cuba, we have residual sanctions in place because the Congress will not repeal the laws. So an executive order gets made, and then Congress enacts a law locking in, and then you have to repeal the law, which requires a general consensus. But long period of hostility, then it's very hard to get it's very easy to defeat that, very hard to get a, let's say, a new mentality put into place. That's what I fear. I believe that in this particular case, it's going to be an interesting question to what extent the other countries who are affected, the Germans, for example, the Chinese definitely, to what extent they are willing to play along or defy the sanctions regime. And that may evolve over time in ways which may surprise the United States. That's my view.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, surely there's some more.
Can I ask? And some Russian politicians say that sanctions that are imposed on us by USA help us to improve our economic situation, because we need to thrive some interests in our country, for example, farming. Because do you think, is it true?
Yes, I think it can be true. That's not necessarily going to be the case, but I think it can be true, yes. I think when you see protectionist measures generally, they can result in, let's say, patterns of investment that change the course of economic development in a country. And so it's certainly the case that if you look at industrial development going back to the 19th century, the United States, after Madison, Germany, under the influence of Friedrich List, Japan in the post-war period, Korea in the post-war period, all of these, and China, of course, all of these countries built up their industries and built up their in particular technological strength behind certain protection from the outside world. Now, sanctions are, in some sense, imposed form of protection. So it's not obvious that they obviously have a cost, because you don't have access to outside technologies and you don't have access to financial transfers and other things that you might like to have. But on the other hand, this is not certainly the first time that countries have faced this problem and solved it at least, moderately well. And so, for every, it's a chess game. For every move, there's a counter move. And we're not at the end of them.
And excuse me, Vladimir Putin says that we need good economists nowadays. And what do we need to become as good economists as you are? What is your advice? Is it enough to study well in university, or maybe we need to do something more?
Oh boy. That's a multi-edged question with an element of flattery, and that's a very tricky question. First of all, I don't think the record of outside economists is particularly good, and one has to be very careful. But I think, to come back to the theme that I was getting across today, if you go back to my father's generation, and he's by no means the only one, he did not have develop his ideas in an academic setting or in reaction to other academics. He was not scholastic in any sense. He came into economics from agriculture, from wartime planning. Kuznets came into economics from building national income accounts and from managing war production. Leontiev came into academic economics from operations research and input-output analysis. You can go down the list. The econometricians came in from weather forecasting and calculating German war production. The strategic bombing survey was an exercise in economic analysis. All of these people, for the later part of their careers, they had the confidence of having experienced a public role. And as far as having such experience amongst modern economists, I may be one of the last ones. I was had a role in the congressional staff in the 1970s, but it's exceedingly rare that any academic economist has done anything except sit at a desk and run a computer surveys or statistical studies or simply plotted out the trajectories of differential equation systems, this kind of thing, which is not going to get you, it's not going to place you in a position where you can be a useful figure, in helping a government. So my advice, I will give advice on the question of economists, which is be very careful about economists and be sure that the people you have working on problems know those problems first and foremost and have their tools of analysis in their hip pockets for when they need them. But don't unleash people who have only tools of analysis and no knowledge and no common sense.
Thank you very much that you found time to visit our university and deliver this interesting information.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank you all for coming. Спасибо большое.
Уважаемые коллеги, и у нас еще остался один пункт повестки дня, презентация сборника статей, и несколько слов буквально скажет руководитель научного общества имени Джона Гэлбрейта Игорь Викторович Нагаев.
Уважаемые коллеги, мы решили, что первый, кто задаст вопрос, тот получит книгу. Девушка, ваша книга, получайте, пишите господина Джеймса Гэлбрейта. Вот, за смелость. Значит, мы предлагаем вашему вниманию книгу, которая называется «Виражи и риски экономики будущего». О чем эта книга? Значит, о чем эта книга? Вот сейчас Россия пытается строить высокотехнологичную экономику. Ну, экономику будущего, цифровую экономику. Но для этого, прежде чем строить экономику такую, надо заложить идеи, фундамент идей. Вы понимаете, то есть нужны идеи. За идеями мы обращаемся к генератору идей, то есть к экономической теории. И тут нас, к сожалению, постигает разочарование, потому что экономическая теория по Хайеку и Фридману, она находится в кризисе. Это слова не мои. И вот в 2009 году журнал The Economist в статье под названием «Почему экономическая наука перестала работать», значит, пишет о бессилии современной экономической теории перед лицом кризиса 2008 года, который отнюдь не закончился. И вот она написала, журнал Economist вот написал: из всех недавно лопнувших экономических пузырей громче всех треснула репутация экономической теории. То есть по Хайеку и Фридману экономическая теория, все, она уже не работает. Вот 40 лет идет этот мейнстрим, и он уходит. Он где-то зародился в конце 70-х годов. Ну, вы учебники читали, вот где-то конец 70-х, начало 80-х годов. И вот он идет 40 лет, и вот он уже уходит, он уже на излете. Вопрос: откуда черпать идеи будем? Вот откуда-то надо взять идеи. И вот здесь возникает вопрос: нам нужен какой-то очень мощный экономист, который бы не был связан, скован узами мейнстрима, который бы работал в госорганах, то есть знал, что такое экономика не понаслышке. И вот тут и возникает Джон Гэлбрейт. Вот. Понимаете? То есть он не просто экономист. Ну, он экономист, государственный деятель, а помимо этого, вот это очень важное его достоинство, он еще и философ, то есть экономический философ. Это вот как раз то, что нам сейчас нужно. И вот здесь мы поместили ну, одну из таких, вот, на наш взгляд, ключевых его работ. Это последняя его работа, которую он написал в 2004 году. Она называется «Экономика невинного обмана. Правда нашего времени». То есть эта книга, значит, эта книга была издана в 2009 году и стала библиографической редкостью. То есть она исчезла. Но вы ее можете не искать, она вот здесь. Мы ее сюда положили. Помимо этого, хотелось бы вот узнать, а как устроена американская экономика? Вот как она работает? Причем из первых уст, вот от самих, от какого-то крупного американского ученого. И мы сюда включили прекрасную работу профессора Джеймса Гэлбрейта, которая называется «Какова американская модель на самом деле?». Вот я советую ее вам проконспектировать, вот именно проконспектировать. Она очень поможет вам, ну, добавит вам понимание о том, что такое американская модель. Все-таки самая продвинутая модель, ну, это все-таки, извините, американская модель. Мы также сюда включили статьи, которые... То есть нам очень хотелось посмотреть на эту проблему, вот, на что такое экономическая теория, проблемы экономической теории из России, то есть российский наш взгляд. Да? И поэтому мы сюда включили прекрасные статьи вот, академика Никипелова, Джон Гэлбрейт и современная экономическая теория, профессора Сорокина, политической экономии и менеджмента, профессора Пороховского, планирующая система Джона Гэлбрейта, современные перспективы. Обратите внимание, не просто планирующая система, но те, кто экономисты, те знают, что такое планирующая система, это понятие Джона Гэлбрейта. А здесь планирующая система, современные перспективы. То есть он смотрит на вот, концепции Гэлбрейта с позиции нашего времени. Вот. Ну и так далее, и другие работы. И в заключение хочу сказать, что мы должны читать Джона Гэлбрейта и Джеймса Гэлбрейта вне зависимости от состояния российско-американских отношений. Потому что это классика экономической науки. Спасибо большое за внимание.
May I just say a few words because I want to also to give some presents to our guests. Dear Professor Galbraith, I'm privileged also to give you a book that was edited and composed and thought of by our foundation. And Mr. Nagaev, who just spoke, is one of the sponsors of the idea. This is the reprint of the articles in American and British press written by the American and British war correspondents in the Soviet Union at the year of Stalingrad battle. Reading this doesn't need any commentaries or comparison with what is being written now in the West. Because these people, I mean the correspondents, first of all, they were greatly educated people because they spoke Russian, they have read Pushkin and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, so they knew the culture of the country they were working in, especially at such times. And they were, of course, fully sympathizing with the battle, and they shared with drivers who were bringing him to and from all the difficulties of the year. And they wrote about Russian spirit, not Soviet, Russian spirit, Russian heroes, etc. So there is a foreword written by Professor Nagaev, the son of one of the heroes of Stalingrad, which just gives for American, especially young people who do not know much geography, as far as I noticed when I was working there, how long was the line of the front, how difficult and what enormous effort, national effort, it needed to survive and to hold it and to stop the invaders. So please take this.
Thank you very much.
And this is my book, but it is in French, so maybe it's also about the polemics. Absolutely. I immediately understood that it will find the understanding reader.
Ja, это спасибо большое. Очень интересно. Очень великий книга.
Thank you very much for it.
Thank you.